when you think back about some of the evidence and you start putting these pieces together, I think that a very different picture emerges than what perhaps it might have seemed at the beginning. And so, again, during the same time period where the defendant is supposedly having this wonderful marriage and this great home life, you heard about the hundreds of sexually graphic, intimate photos she took of herself, or she and Baker took of themselves having sex, or having sex with third parties, literally living a different life. And you were told that there was no reason in the world that the defendant would want Fabio harmed. Well, she also told you that the defendant was the one who was duped, as if, again, the defendant is the victim in this case. But in order to buy in to that fiction, you'd have to ignore a mountain of evidence to believe any of that. And they told you in opening statement that Fabio purchased one life insurance policy, and that was only for Luigi. That was also false. As you heard from the evidence, in this case, the defendant knew.
Ladies and gentlemen, if anything that any counsel says to you does not mesh with your interpretation of the evidence, it is your interpretation of the evidence at counsel, not the comments of counsel. With that, the objection is overruled.
The defendant knew about Fabio's various life insurance policies. And she knew that she was the main beneficiary. And we're going to talk about that. You were also told that the defendant made clear to Baker she wasn't interested in leaving Fabio because she loved her life so much. Well, what you saw was on November, I believe it was November 3rd of 2016, the defendant wrote Mrs. Baker on Baker's bedroom mirror. The same day, as you recall, Baker messaged his friend Mr. Spence that he and the defendant would be living together within 3 months. Well, if you count out from 3 months, from November 3rd, that takes you to right after the murder, the beginning of February. So the time frame that he gave in November, obviously they were already contemplating planning for this date. And they told you that Baker contacted the defendant 2/3 of the time, as if somehow that meant that he was some stalker that the defendant couldn't get rid of. But that wasn't true, according to what you heard, not only from the phone records, the cell phone data, the photographs that were contained in the defendant's iCloud on the defendant's Dropbox, and from the testimony of Cyree. In fact, almost one half of all of her communications through her cell phone were with Baker. And you heard that she had more communications with Baker than she did with her husband and her children put together. She called Baker, as you heard from Cyree, 414 times during the same time period that Baker called her 163 times. He texted more, but she called more. And you heard about the extreme volume of communications between them. Another thing that you heard was that the defendant was the one who was sending these sexually graphic photos to Baker. And you heard that that took place while she was on vacation with Fabio. I think there was a testimony about her being on vacation in Cabo San Lucas, while they were in Hawaii together, while she was with her family in Toronto on vacation, from her home, pictures where she was lying on the living room couch, naked, and of course also while they were in Toronto for Fabio's funeral services. You heard zero evidence that she was forced to do anything, that these were things she engaged in of her own free will, choices that she made. And as we all know, sometimes too well, the choices that we make have consequences. And of course, she got sloppy and she got arrogant. She never thought she was going to get caught. She never thought that at some point in the future, the photographs that she posed for in Las Vegas, where she's grabbing Baker's crotch and partying with him right after the murder of her husband, were ever going to be recovered, shown to a jury. Her jail mail, calling herself Mrs. Baker. The photograph that I'm going to show you, that you remember, where she writes Mrs. Baker in lipstick on his mirror. Now, we didn't see any of that. We saw her out playing pool in some black dress or bathing suit cover-up. We saw her receiving gifts of clothing from Baker in a parking lot when a surveillance crew was following her, holding up the pieces of clothing, getting into the back seat so she could put on some of this clothes, posing in Robert Baker's garage in various outfits. Some of them we weren't able to show you, but were described for you, posing with a cigar. And they told you that she was devastated by Fabio's death. And yet, what you heard was dramatically different from all of that. Conduct that would not be characterized as devastated. They told you that the defendant was very happy, going out all the time with her friends to karaoke. That was a complete made-up story. As I told you in opening statement, every time she used the excuse karaoke, that was code for an excuse, an innocent, innocuous excuse she'd give her children when she was out with Baker, including on her 20th wedding anniversary, or when she was really posing naked in various locations. You also heard them try to get you to believe that Baker was a stalker, that he was lurking around the Sementilli home, and yet what you heard was a piece of evidence that is so crucial, and that is that the defendant, knowing that her lover is a registered sex offender, 6 counts of having sex with a 14-year-old for a period of time, and then once she turned 15, having sex with her again, and then winding up making pornos with his stepdaughter, the victim of those crimes. What does the defendant do that shows her recklessness, that shows how little she cares about the welfare of her children? The day the new security system is installed, she asks the company for assistance through a text message. And then she says, never mind, I got it. She's able to remotely access her DVR system, her home surveillance cameras, remotely from her phone. We saw evidence that she had done so on several different occasions. The next thing she does on that date, June 28th of 2016, she sends the password information to Robert Baker so that he can log on and watch the home. That's not Baker being a stalker. That's the defendant giving him access to information, again, about the sanctuary of their home, where she lives with 2 young daughters. Who does that? The only thing that you heard during this case that the defense pointed out to you was that there was an occasion where Jessica got a flat tire on a freeway or a road, and she and her sister Isabella testified they don't know whether their mother called Baker to help or not, because Jessica had Baker's cell phone number, as you recall, in her phone, because they thought he was a close family friend after the murder and that he helped them and was at the house all the time, that he came to help her out with her tire. And of course, she came into court to give you the party line that the defendant, that Baker was weird and that they thought there was something strange by how much he was around after the murder, although they never bothered to say that to law enforcement during the half dozen times, or maybe a couple less, that they ever were interviewed, and that Baker was so nice to her and to them. That's when they started having a problem with Baker, after their mother was arrested together with Robert Baker, and they learned for the first time that their mother had been lying to them for a year. The other story I believe that they brought up, again, which proved nothing, was that at some point Isabella went to, I think it was a Denny's, and she was seated next to a table where Baker was already seated, which means Baker was there before her. So again, all of that was revisionist history. This is one of the videos that was shown to you. But this is how Fabio ended his life at this house that he loved so much. Remember, Sam Pulera talked about they loved this house, and one of the reasons loved it, it was Queen Victoria, which reminded them of their country that they were from Canada. And here you see in the photograph on the left, the Rolex on his left wrist. So again, when I tell you that what she did to Fabio was the ultimate betrayal, I am not overstating that. The fact that she was pretending to be this loving wife and mother every day, day in and day out, when she lived with this man for almost 20 years, while plotting his murder with her lover, that's the reason we're all here. Had she just divorced Fabio, none of us would be here. That would be none of our business. But the conspiracy to kill him, that makes her entire obsessive, lurid affair highly relevant evidence in this case. And that's why you were provided with that evidence, because it does provide motive. It provides motive for what happened in this case to Fabio Sementilli. And that is one critical piece of evidence. No matter how you want to downplay it, or cover it up, or try to conceal it, the fact that she lured him into thinking that their marriage was solid and then had him murdered in his favorite place shows how evil this crime was. That was the truth that the evidence showed in this case. And so, as I mentioned, there are layers and layers of evidence that we've provided to you that this defendant, as I said in my opening statement, was living a double life that she grew tired of, that she wanted more. She wanted to be able to live her life with the person, as you heard from her own mouth say, with the person she believed was her soulmate. For the break, I was talking about the double life that the defendant was living in 2016 and through January of 2017 before Fabio's murder. And we talked about the fact that she wanted to be able to live full time with her lover, her soulmate, travel together, and then we saw the evidence of the lengths that she went to in order to get that life. And then if there wasn't already enough evidence of all of this, then during the most painful, heart-wrenching days for anybody who loved and cared about Fabio, she was busy taking graphic sex photos of herself that she then sent to Baker. And I would state that certainly anybody with any degree of care for Fabio would not have been doing that during that particularly solemn time. Yet, what you heard was this implausible, ridiculous tale that they tried to spin, that somehow Robert Baker, who's about as bright as a rock, managed to extract sufficient information, sufficient, specific, particular information from the defendant without her knowledge, without her assistance, and through a long series of what would then be, I guess, coincidences, he managed to figure out exactly when he could get Fabio alone. Not just on one occasion, but on two. I don't know if any of you people engage in gambling or betting, but I don't know that that's a gamble that one would take without having that information. And to also have to believe, you'd have to suspend all disbelief that the defendant never suspected Baker was involved, and that she still didn't believe it when the LAPD tell her, we found Baker's DNA all over the crime scene. And what does she do? What does she do next? She comes up with an excuse to explain it away. And then you also heard not only the attack, as I said, on the witnesses who tried to help the defendant and then realized they had been betrayed, but also on the LAPD and on their investigation. And that somehow the LAPD were so biased against this woman, and that there was a rush to judgment because they were having an affair. And you heard that same tactic through 4 different sets of investigating officers, and each of them, Detective Verna, retired, Detective Gable, retired, Detective Roberts, retired, Detective Farrell, still on the job, they all told you the same thing. They were willing to investigate as long as it took to make sure that everyone involved in this murder conspiracy is brought to justice. And they may never be done. And you heard questions about that. And the judge is going to instruct you about if anybody has any issues or questions with respect to any other parties who perhaps have not yet been brought to justice, how you are to treat that evidence in this case, and that is not necessarily evidence of anything. But in this case, despite the argument that all of these homicide detectives from LAPD just went out and arrested the defendant because she was having an affair, what you also heard, one after another, testify to was the mountain of evidence that they produced throughout the course of their investigation. You heard Detective Roberts, I think she reiterated again yesterday on the stand, over 220,000 pages of paper reports, over 8 terabytes. I don't know how many of you are computer people. 8 terabytes of data. Some computers don't even hold 8 terabytes. But the defense wants you to believe that somehow law enforcement just decided to arrest and prosecute the defendant because of an affair. If that is the defense in this case, then I sat through a very, very different trial. And in this case, you also heard the attacks on the opposite side. Well, why does it take you so long? Why don't you just run up to Alaska and arrest Christopher Austin? If you had information that he was in town, even though you don't have any evidence connecting him to the murder, you have evidence that he's connected to Baker, and there's flight records showing he came into town and then he left. Why don't you go up and arrest him and then ask him some questions? Well, that's not how it works, as you heard. Detectives are going, good ones, are going to take their time. As you heard from Detective Verna, they're going to build their case. You heard about Deborah Obad yesterday saying, well, I called Parshall like 50 times, and I said, go investigate this person, and go look at that person, and run this plate, and that's not how it works. There has to be evidence, and they build their case. And they're not going to tell the defendant or Miss Obad or anybody else in the public. They didn't even tell, as you heard, we brought in Jim Duggan. He was the security officer, the chief security officer for Cody out of New York. And when Fabio was murdered, he was brought in to make sure that it didn't have anything to do with the corporation. And one of the things he did is he reached out to Detectives Verna and Parshall. And what did he tell you? He said, well, like any other good detective, they were very tight-lipped. They weren't going to tell me anything. They'll listen to you. They'll take your information. But they're not going to tell you what leads they're working. They're not going to tell you what angles they're looking at. They're not going to tell you what search warrants they're serving. They're not going to tell you who they're interviewing. That's not what a homicide detective or any good detective is going to do. They're going to bide their time. They're going to build their case. They're going to make sure that before they accuse somebody, that they have the goods to back it up. And so you heard about that through 4 sets of investigating officers who all told you the same thing. Now, one of the other things that you heard in this case is that the defendant is somebody who uses other people. She uses other people to do her bidding, to do her dirty work for her. That includes her daughters. You heard in this case that she had Jessica lie to her father by promising not to tell him when Jessica found Baker sleeping in her mother's bed when Fabio was away on a business trip. And you heard that on February 21st, when Detective Parshall and Detective Verna interviewed the defendant at her home, that they also separately interviewed Jessica. And Jessica was the first one who brought that up to law enforcement. And yet, when they talked to the defendant, remember, tried to downplay her relationship with Robert Baker. Also, after the murder, remember, the defendant used Jessica to lie to family and friends who were calling to check in on Monica and the girls, to check on their welfare, because they were worried about them after the murder. And so, what does the defendant tell Jessica? Tell them I'm asleep. Tell them you're just hanging out. When in reality, we know the defendant's out at bars and comedy clubs and partying with Baker. You heard from Melanie Garibay. Melanie Garibay, as you recall, worked for Wella. She was one of their show directors for these large corporate events that they would put on in places like Los Angeles or Vegas or other places around the country, and that the defendant lied to her and told her that Fabio knew that she was planning a trip to Las Vegas in March. And so Fabio had told her to get in contact with Mel, and Mel would get her a deal on a suite. Remember that? And clearly we know that the defendant and Robert Baker were planning these trips even before Fabio's death, because you heard and saw Baker's Facebook message to Ron Ray, where he said he and the defendant, this is in, again, November of 2016, are coming to Las Vegas soon, so he can introduce her to them and they can all hang out together. You also heard from Sal Macheri, who was the CEO at Wella, and then Cody. You heard from Dave Diaz, also was Fabio's boss previously through Wella, and Henry Meyer, the HR director for Wella for North America. And you heard how the defendant used their relationship with Fabio, with her husband, and played on their grief, their sorrow, because they were close with Fabio, to get them to do things for her, including things that they put into place, as Henry and Sal Macheri talked about, things that the company had never done before that they believed were exceptional, like paying somebody's widow's 6 months' salary, extending health care for the entire family and benefits for the family for 6 months, writing off a $9,000 company car loan on the car that, the truck that Fabio had. And you heard about all of the things that were done in the aftermath of Fabio's murder to try and ease some of the burden on the defendant. You also heard from Sheila Salahian. Remember, Sheila is married to Ricardo, and they traveled together. They went on dates, double dated together. In 2016, she and her husband were friendly with the defendant and Baker through the racquetball league. And we heard that the defendant used her as a cover, so that when Jessica found Baker sleeping in her mother's bed when Fabio was away, the defendant lied to Jessica and said, well, Sheila and Rob were both over the night before, and they both had too much to drink, and so they couldn't drive home. But we know from Sheila's testimony, she never spent the night at the house. In fact, she told you that the only time she had ever been to the house was, I believe it was the Wednesday or Thursday after the murder where she saw Baker for the first time at LA Fitness, and he told Sheila and Ricardo about Monica's husband being murdered and asked if they would go over to the house with him and Matt to pay a condolence call. And that was the only time Sheila had ever been there. In fact, the defendant tells law enforcement the same, that Sheila's never only been to the house once, and that was after the murder. But she uses her as a cover. She also uses Sheila as a cover when she tells her daughters or when she tells Anna that she's going out to, as I said, karaoke is the big cover story after the murder on night when they're invited over to Fabio's best friend's house, Ernie Valorano, and Anna's in town, and she won't let her sister come with, but she's going to go do karaoke with Sheila. Sheila told you she never went out, never did karaoke with the defendant. The only time she ever got together with the defendant is when they got together as couples, and always with her husband, Ricardo. And then you also heard how she used Ernie Valorano and Sam Pulera, Fabio's friends and colleagues, in order to get sympathy and support, and played on their emotions, as you heard about. They also provided other little pieces of evidence that we're going to talk about. So as I said, the defendant wasn't going to do the dirty work herself, right? She's not going to kill Fabio. But she knew that Baker would, because Baker is a stone-cold killer. And he's willing to do it, and she knows that he's going to find somebody to assist him who's loyal to him in order to kill Fabio. They needed somebody who was gullible. They needed somebody who wasn't particularly bright, would go along with the program, would not ask a lot of questions, somebody who would do whatever Baker asked him to do. We can call him, if you will, the patsy in this case. And Christopher Austin was the perfect choice, because once he was convinced to directly participate in the killing, Baker and the defendant believed he'd never talk, that he'd never squeal, he'd never say anything about what happened, because he would have skin in the game. It would take him down as well. What they didn't count on, what they didn't account for, which was between the time of the murder in January of 2017 and subsequent to that time, that he would meet somebody, that he'd fall in love, that he'd get married, that he'd have a baby, and that he would have a family who became more important to him than Baker. And so at that point, he was somebody who was willing to give law enforcement the details of what he knew, to come clean, because he knew they had the goods on him. On top of that, Christopher Austin, whether you believe him or not, has a conscience. And he feels bad. Does that matter after the fact? I don't know. But while the defendant and Robert Baker got what they wanted, which was Fabio dead and plenty of money to start a new life, possibly in another state or country, they were very arrogant and they made mistakes. And they went, as you heard, to great lengths. And perhaps you were wondering during the days in and out of the testimony of various witnesses, including Detective Mitzi Roberts, about all these little small pieces of evidence as I was putting in various pieces of paper and talking about things that were now going to connect up. And you heard me do some of that through the testimony of Robert Baker. But they went to great lengths to cover their tracks. And they went to great lengths to destroy evidence, such as deleting encrypted applications, as you heard, from their cell phone and all of its accompanying data, or their messages immediately after the murder, or the messages that went back and forth between the defendant and her husband on January 22nd, which if she had no part in what was supposed to happen on the 22nd, she would have had no reason to delete those messages. And then, of course, on top of that, you also heard the defendant make various admissions. And the judge is going to instruct you on the difference between what is a confession and what is an admission under the law. Confession being where somebody admits to all of the elements of a crime, an admission, a statement that perhaps infers guilt or admits to certain portions of a crime or something of that nature, and you're going to receive those instructions probably, as I said, tomorrow. But what we also saw, and as I mentioned at the beginning today, was that Baker and the defendant were like a two-person wrecking crew. Or as Baker said, and you heard this yourself, when they were in the court lockup, he referred to them as Bonnie and Clyde. Now, some of you might be a little young, but I'm sure the rest will fill you in. Bonnie and Clyde were famous for robbing people, killing people. They were a couple, and they were on the run, and so you hear Baker making comments about how he and the defendant are Bonnie and Clyde because they were destroying everything and everyone in their path, and you heard them in the back once again scheming on how they're going to explain away the evidence against themselves and how they have to stick together, because if one rolls on the other, meaning one talks or testifies against the other, they both go down. And you heard them talk about sticking to the program, sticking to protocol. Even yesterday, you heard that there were, from Detective Roberts, that there was approximately 60 hours of recorded conversations between the defendant and Robert Baker during the time that their case was winding its way very slowly through the criminal justice system. And that the case started out in Van Nuys, and that there were two dates, one of which was June 29th of 2017, and the next one I believe was August 7th of 2017, and after that the case was transferred downtown because they knew it was going to be this lengthy case. And so you heard them talking in the lockup back in June, subsequent to their arrest, where they discussed on June 29th that Baker saying stick to the program. And you heard yesterday, and maybe you weren't thrilled that you were going to be hearing even more recordings, but it was brief. But what I want to point out to you is that, again, we're talking about 60 hours altogether between the 6 dates where recordings were done in the lockup in conjunction with the Sheriff's Department. And out of 60 hours, in order to give you what the defense thought was beneficial, you heard what you heard yesterday. And even in that portion, you heard them talking about concocting a defense. You heard Baker talking to the defendant about sticking to the program. As Detective Gable, who previously was in the military himself and testified about that, when you hear protocol, that is a plan that's been discussed, where you put it into practice and it becomes the policy. It becomes the protocol. And that's the language, the type of language and the scheming that you heard from these defendants.